Imagine a single idea that could change the course of entire nations, spark revolutions, and reshape the global balance of power. Sounds like fiction, right? But it's not. In the 20th century, one powerful ideology did just that. It wasn't just a theory, it became a force that swept through continents, changing the lives of millions. Did you know that at its peak, more than a third of the world's population lived under governments that followed this ideology? From China to Cuba, from Russia to Africa, it inspired revolutions, altered economies, and created both hope and fear across the globe. But as we'll see, the journey wasn't all smooth. The ideology promised equality, but did it deliver? Was it a tool for true freedom, or did it become a weapon for total control? In this video, we'll dive into the rise of this powerful idea, the strategies behind its spread, and the shocking realities that followed. We'll uncover surprising facts, like how one revolution influenced more than 100 countries, or why millions were drawn to an idea that ultimately led to some of the world's darkest moments. Stick around, and let's explore how this ideology reshaped the world, sometimes in ways we never expected. Chapter 1: The genesis of a global shift. In the early 20th century, political ideologies were in constant flux. The world was witnessing rapid industrialization, social change, and the aftermath of brutal wars. Amid this chaos, one ideology began to shape nations in ways no one could have imagined. It wasn't just a theory, it was a call to action. Its goal was simple yet bold: to change the very structure of society. Leaders and thinkers around the world began to realize that the traditional systems of power were no longer effective. This ideology was born from the need to address inequality. For the working class, the divide between the rich and poor seemed insurmountable. The working class had no power, no voice, and no hope. The ideology promised them a system where their voices would finally be heard. It was radical, yes, but it tapped into the growing anger of millions of people suffering under oppressive systems. Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto laid the groundwork for this ideology, offering a revolutionary perspective on how society should be organized. He argued that history was driven by class struggles, and that the working class would eventually rise up to overthrow the capitalist class. This was not just an abstract theory. Marx's ideas were a call to arms, urging workers to unite and fight for their future. By the 1910s and 1920s, this ideology began to take root in various parts of the world. It was not just a philosophical idea anymore, it became a political movement with real power. One of the key strategies was the appeal to the masses. Leaders used simple, direct language to reach people who had no formal education but understood the pain of poverty. In Russia, Vladimir Lenin took these ideas and put them into practice. Lenin didn't just talk about revolution, he made it happen. In 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution overthrew the Tsarist regime, establishing the world's first socialist state. It was a perfect example of how a clear vision and powerful strategy could transform an entire nation. But the ideology wasn't limited to Russia. It spread to China, Cuba, and even parts of Africa. In China, Mao Zedong's version of the ideology led to the Chinese Revolution. His strategy was simple: gain the support of the peasants, who were the majority in China. By framing the struggle as one between the peasantry and the elite, Mao united millions in support of his cause. This global spread wasn't just about ideas, it was also about strategic alliances. In many cases, countries adopted this ideology as a way to break free from colonial rule. In Africa, for example, countries like Ghana and Angola saw this ideology as a means to resist imperialism and gain independence. The strategy was clear: use the ideology to unite the masses against foreign powers and internal elites. In the years that followed, many countries implemented some form of this ideology. From the rise of socialist states to the growth of labor unions, the influence was undeniable. One of the key reasons this ideology swept the world was its promise of equality and social justice. It spoke to the masses in a way that other ideologies simply didn't. It gave people hope that they could shape their futures. Chapter 2: The Domino Effect. How one idea ignited a chain reaction. When the first socialist states were established, they didn't just stay within their borders. They became symbols for the rest of the world. The success of the Soviet Union inspired movements in every corner of the globe. Countries that were struggling with poverty, inequality, and colonial rule saw this new system as a pathway to a better future. The spread of this ideology was not an accident. It was carefully planned. The Soviet Union became a model, providing resources, training, and support to revolutionary movements worldwide. This strategy was known as exporting the revolution. In countries like Vietnam and Cuba, the Soviet Union supported local communists in their struggles for power. In Cuba, Fidel Castro's revolution became a shining example of this new way of organizing society. Castro's victory in 1959, with the support of both urban and rural populations, showed that revolution could work even in the face of overwhelming odds. Castro's ability to unite people from different walks of life under one banner of social justice was a masterstroke of strategy. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh applied similar tactics. He didn't just rely on urban centers, he took his revolution to the countryside, where the majority of the population lived. By focusing on rural areas, Ho was able to build a broad-based support system that was crucial to the success of the North Vietnamese resistance. As the years passed, more countries adopted some form of this ideology. In the 1960s, leftist movements gained ground in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Many of these movements were inspired by the successes of the Soviet Union and China. In each case, the ideology offered an alternative to the existing order, a chance for the oppressed to take control. The strategy of using ideology to unite diverse groups continued to be effective. In Africa, independence movements in countries like Algeria and Angola adopted elements of socialism in their fight against colonial powers. This helped solidify the idea that the ideology wasn't just about class, it was about creating a new world order based on fairness and equality. The domino effect was real. As one country after another embraced this ideology, it became clear that it was no longer just a fringe idea, it was a movement that could change the world. Even in Western countries like France and Italy, socialist parties gained significant ground, influencing government policies and social reforms. Chapter 3: Power Players, the architects behind the revolution. Behind every successful ideology, there are key figures whose vision and determination turn ideas into action. These leaders understood the power of strategy and used it to create lasting change. Karl Marx may have started the movement, but it was Lenin, Mao, Castro, and others who turned the theory into practice. Lenin's leadership was crucial to the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. He understood that revolution wasn't just about ideas, it was about organization and timing. Lenin's strategy was to strike when the moment was right, using discontent among the masses as a springboard for revolution. He also focused on building a tightly organized party that could lead the revolution effectively. Mao Zedong took a different approach in China. His focus was on the peasants, who made up the majority of China's population. Mao's strategy was rooted in the idea that the revolution needed to come from the countryside, not the cities. His famous Long March in 1934–35 helped solidify his leadership among the people and gave him the credibility to lead China through its revolutionary struggle. Fidel Castro's strategy was built on a similar understanding of the importance of grassroots support. By launching a guerrilla war against the Batista regime, Castro demonstrated that even a small group of committed individuals could topple an established government. His ability to rally the Cuban people to his cause, despite initial setbacks, proved the power of ideological commitment. These leaders had one thing in common: they knew how to use the ideology as a tool for uniting people. Whether through revolutionary rhetoric, guerrilla warfare, or appeals to social justice, each leader used the ideology to rally support and create powerful movements. Their strategies weren't just about winning battles, they were about winning hearts and minds. Each of these leaders also recognized the importance of external support. They understood that revolution wasn't just about local power, it was about building alliances with other countries and movements that shared their goals. The Soviet Union, for example, provided vital resources to many of these movements, strengthening the global impact of the ideology. Through their strategic efforts, Marxist-inspired movements spread across the world. They didn't just win battles, they changed the political landscape forever. Don't forget to subscribe for more on how these revolutionary figures reshaped the world and the legacy of their strategies. Chapter 4: Resistance and Rebellion. When ideology meets opposition. As the ideology spread, it wasn't universally welcomed. Many powerful elites saw it as a direct threat to their status. For them, the ideology's message of equality and redistribution was an existential challenge. Resistance came not only from wealthy countries but from traditional institutions like the Catholic Church, monarchies, and military regimes. In the 1950s and 1960s, one of the strongest forms of resistance came from the United States, which saw the spread of communism as a direct threat to democracy and capitalism. The US used a strategy of containment, aiming to stop the spread of this ideology through economic, political, and military means. This led to the famous Cold War, where both superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, fought for global influence without direct military conflict. One of the most notable moments of resistance came in 1956, during the Hungarian Revolution. The Hungarian people, inspired by a desire for reform and greater freedoms, rose up against their Soviet-backed government. Initially, the Soviet Union was slow to respond, but soon military intervention crushed the rebellion. This event demonstrated how powerful the ideological divide could be, as the people's hopes for a better future clashed with the iron will of the state. In Latin America, the US government worked to prevent the spread of communist ideas through covert operations and economic aid. The infamous CIA-led operation in Guatemala in 1954, known as Operation PBSUCCESS, helped overthrow a democratically elected government that had moved toward land reforms, an idea rooted in Marxist principles. This intervention created a bitter backlash in many parts of the world, fueling even more resistance movements. Despite such efforts, there were many countries where the ideology took root, but not without significant pushback. In Cuba, for instance, after Fidel Castro's revolution, the US imposed a trade embargo that continues to this day. Castro's response was to strengthen his alliance with the Soviet Union, proving that resistance only made the revolutionaries more determined. Resistance also came from within the ideologies themselves. In China, Mao Zedong faced dissent within the Communist Party during the Cultural Revolution. His strategy for dealing with opposition was to radicalize the masses, turning them into «Red Guards», who would enforce ideological purity. This led to violent purges and widespread chaos, showing how internal resistance could be just as dangerous as external opposition. Chapter 5, From Utopia to Dystopia, The Promises versus the Realities. The ideology promised a utopian society where equality and fairness reign. But as many countries implemented these ideas, the reality often fell short. What was once envisioned as a society where wealth and power were shared equally, turned into bureaucratic states ruled by party elites. One of the major contradictions came in the Soviet Union, where Joseph Stalin's version of the ideology involved mass purges and a totalitarian regime that controlled every aspect of life. The promises of freedom, equality, and justice seemed to be swallowed by the harsh reality of oppression. By the 1930s, millions of people were sent to labor camps or executed for even minor perceived opposition to the state. It became clear that in some places, the ideology was no longer about empowerment, it was about control. In Cuba, Fidel Castro's promises of social justice and equal opportunity led to improvements in healthcare and education, but they also resulted in the suppression of political dissent. Critics argue that while the country made advancements in certain areas, Castro's authoritarian rule limited the freedoms of the very people he sought to help. Mao's version of the ideology in China was also fraught with contradictions. The Great Leap Forward, an effort to rapidly industrialize the nation, led to widespread famine and the deaths of millions. His strategy of collectivizing agriculture was supposed to ensure equal distribution of resources, but it ended in disaster, with millions starving as a result of failed policies. The Cultural Revolution, designed to remove capitalist influences, created chaos and turned millions of people against one another. While the promises of the ideology often included economic equality, in practice, many of these nations ended up with huge gaps between the elites and the common people. In the Soviet Union, the Communist Party elite lived in luxury while the rest of the population suffered in poverty. This led to growing disillusionment among the very people the ideology was meant to help. In Africa, countries like Angola and Mozambique adopted the ideology to combat colonialism and imperialism, yet many of these nations struggled to meet the lofty expectations set by their leaders. While there were efforts to redistribute land and wealth, in many cases, corruption and civil conflict undermined these ambitions. In some cases, the elites that emerged after independence were just as oppressive as the colonial powers they replaced. Despite these failures, the ideology's enduring appeal lay in its simplicity. The idea of creating a more equal world spoke directly to the struggles of people across the globe. However, the gap between the theory and the practice became a source of increasing frustration for many. While its promises were alluring, the harsh reality was often much more complex. Chapter 6, The Future of Ideology, A New Dawn or a Fading Legend. As the world has changed, so has the role of the ideology that once swept the globe. Today, many of the countries that once embraced it have seen their economic systems evolve. China, for example, has adopted a market-oriented approach, blending elements of capitalism with state control, a model often referred to as state capitalism. This shift in strategy has allowed China to become one of the world's most powerful economies, but it has raised questions about the true nature of the ideology. In Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a dramatic shift towards capitalism and democracy in the 1990s, although the country still retains many aspects of its past. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia has reverted to more authoritarian methods, though it maintains a facade of socialism. The rise of global capitalism in the 21st century, with the spread of multinational corporations and the growth of economic inequality, has made the promises of the original ideology seem more distant. The increasing gap between the rich and the poor, particularly in the West, has led to a renewed interest in leftist ideas. However, the modern political landscape seems more fractured than ever, with many people questioning whether traditional ideologies still have the power to unite. Some believe that we are witnessing a new form of the ideology, one that adapts to the modern world. Movements like democratic socialism in Europe or the rise of progressive politics in the US suggest that the core principles, social justice, equality, and workers' rights, are still relevant. But the challenge remains: how can these ideas be implemented in a world that has become so interconnected and complex? One thing is certain: the ideology will not simply fade away. Even in capitalist nations, discussions about inequality and the need for reform continue to grow. In the end, the ideology's influence on the world is undeniable. It shaped nations, altered global power dynamics, and provided a framework for social change that still resonates today. Don't forget to subscribe to get the latest updates on the evolving future of this powerful ideology and its impact on the world today.